Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Miss Wagers, and we are going to continue with lesson 3 by reading chapter 8 today. So we are going to go ahead and get started. We are learning to describe characters and settings so that we can examine how the literary elements of a narrative work together. So remember, a narrative is a story. And so Lunch Money is a chapter book, but it's also a narrative. It's a made-up story. We know we're successful when we can describe characters in the story based on their thoughts, emotions, and actions, and also describe the settings of the story. Now, we're not going to focus as much on the setting today since we've focused on that more in yesterday's lesson. We're really going to be focusing on the characters and their actions and their thoughts. For vocabulary, we have the word greedy. So greedy is having or showing an intense selfish desire for something, especially wealth or power. But imagine with that cake, look at them. They take the big part and not the smaller piece, being greedy about it. And then our second vocabulary word we have is gasps. So that is to inhale suddenly with the mouth open out of pain or astonishment. So today, probably be out of astonishment, like shock, like, oh my goodness, right? So we have gasp, and I love that little kitty and their little gasp there. For your vocab today, you are going to drag the word to the blank that correctly completes each sentence. So you'll see this assignment on Seesaw. It'll be a drag and drop for you. And we are going to go ahead and get right into reading. We are going to read chapter 8, and it is called Two Down. When Greg got to Mr. Z's room after school on Thursday, no one else was there. He sat at a desk in the front row and looked over at the clock. It was already 3:05. Greg thought, 6 minutes. If he's not here in 6 minutes, I'm going to soccer. A minute later, Mara burst into the room. Sorry, I know I'm late, but Then she only saw Greg there. She stopped and then walked to the front of the room. I thought I was late. You are late, said Greg. He jerked a thumb toward Mr. Z's desk. Just not as late as he is. Mara sat down a few seats away and turned to look out the windows. A minute went by. The empty school felt too quiet to Greg. He said, so what's he want to say to us anyway? Without turning her head, Mara said, 3 guesses. Right, said Greg. Then he remembered what Mara had said about his comic book. It was okay, but... Greg wanted Mara to finish that sentence. Then he thought, what do I care what she thinks? But after another minute of silence, his curiosity won out. Still, he didn't want Mara to think he actually cared what she thought. Then he hit on a way to bring up the subject. Greg said, I read your unicorn book. It was good, for what it is. Mara turned to face him, arching one of her pale eyebrows. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, said Greg. It's not really my kind of story, that's all. You know, princesses and unicorns. I like comic books, and your book isn't a comic. So why did you read it? Greg shrugged. It was the only reading material I had in the nurse's office. I was bored. How come you read my story? Mara tossed her head. Same reason. So why do you think Greg says, I read your comic book, and it was good for what it is? Why do you think he said that? Yeah, right? He doesn't want Mara to think that he actually thinks that she's good, right? He doesn't want her to get a big head or for her to become more competition. So he's just telling her it was good for what it was. There wasn't anything better to do in math. But you bought a copy of mine and you said it was good, right? Yeah, Mara admitted, but that's what Greg had been waiting for. But what? What didn't you like about it? Mara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, Greg saw she was choosing her words carefully. Well, it's sort of like what you said about my book, about it not being your kind of story. See, I know you want to try and sell a lot of copies, Greg interrupted, because you think I'm a greedy little money grubber, right? Mara's eyes flashed. Can you just listen? Greg nodded, and Mara continued. I liked the story, and I liked the artwork too, but I don't think many other girls would. And since half the kids at school are girls, if you write boys' stories, you're only going to sell half as many books as you could. Greg pretended to look shocked and then shook a finger at Mara. Boys' stories? I'm going to tell Mrs. Sanborn what you said. Mrs. Sanborn was their social studies teacher, and she talked a lot about equal rights for women and girls. She got furious whenever someone suggested that men and women, or boys and girls, should be treated differently. Mara said, Don't be dumb. I'm not talking about equal rights. I'm talking about what girls like, and boys. And no matter what Mrs. Sanborn says, most boys don't pick stories about princesses, and most girls don't pick stories about cavemen with spears. As Mara finished that sentence, Mr. Z walked in. Cavemen with spears? Are you two calling each other names again? Mara and Greg shook their heads, and Mr. Z said, Good. I was delayed in the office. I was afraid I'd get here and find you two wrestling on the floor, throwing chairs at each other. But you're not name-calling and not fighting. Looks like progress. He pulled a front row desk forward a few feet, turned it around, and sat midway between them. Mr. Z had been planning what he would say to Greg and Mara all afternoon. He already knew exactly what he wanted this meeting to end up, but he was prepared to take his time getting there. In his mind, it was like a math problem. He would add the right ideas, subtract the wrong ones, divide fuzzy thinking by pure logic, and then he and the children would nod and smile at one another, and peace and understanding multiplied itself. Looking first into Mara's face and then into Greg's, Mr. Z said, Now tell me precisely what started this mess during sixth period. Greg, you first. Greg took a deep breath and then let it out slowly. Well, it really started at the end of lunch period. That's when I found out Mara was selling little books like mine, ripping me off. I did not rip you off. Mara, Mr. Z raised a warning finger. Quiet. Your turn's coming. Mara nodded, but kept on talking. He just said a minute ago that my story is nothing like his. Yeah, said Greg, his voice rising, but it's still a mini book, right? Admit it, you ripped me off. Quiet, both of you. Mr. Z was not used to raising his voice. I am not going to put up with this. If you two can't talk this out with me, then I'll turn the whole matter over to Mrs. Davenport and your parents. He looked from Mara to Greg and then back again. Is that clear? Now I asked Greg to speak first. Mara, not another word. Turning to Greg, he said, So you found out Mara had these little booklets for sale and you got mad. Anything else? Well, said Greg, that didn't seem fair. It was my idea. So yeah, I got mad and I came to class that way and you saw the rest. And that's all. Mr. Z nodded and said to Greg, Okay, now it's your turn to listen. Not one word. Turning to Mara, he said, Let's hear your side. Mara shrugged. There's not much to tell. I mean, what did I do? I was sitting here in class when he comes blasting in and starts shouting and throwing stuff in my face. And me hitting him, that was an accident. He said so himself to the nurse. So I didn't do anything. Greg pushed a puff of air between his lips, not a word, but close enough to draw a glare from the math teacher. Mr. Z turned back to Mara. Show me your little book. Do you have one? So let's stop and think real quick, y'all. Thinking about our learning intentions, we're thinking about our character's actions and emotions and thoughts. So we can see Greg's emotions start to show. What evidence supports that Greg is getting emotional here? What do you think? So we can see that he goes, bah. And that's when it's really starting to show that he's starting to get annoyed or upset again. He's pushing that big breath of air out, kind of a big sigh, like, ugh, because he can't say anything, but he's starting to get worked up again. So that's showing us that he's starting to get emotional. Mara zipped open a pocket on the front of her backpack, pulled out a copy of The Lost Unicorn, and handed it to Mr. Z. He quickly turned the pages, scanning the text and looked at the pictures. Then, turning to Greg, he asked, And how about yours? Greg took a copy from his pencil case and handed it over. Again, Mr. Z did a skim. Looking up from Creon's face to Greg's, he said, So even though these are clearly very different items, you're still mad that Mara did something similar, right? Used the same idea? Greg nodded. Right, my idea. Looking Greg in the eye, Mr. Z said, So you agree with me that this little book with pictures is an idea? Yeah, said Greg. Of course. Like I said, it was my idea. Greg shook his head. That's not what I said. I said a little book with pictures is an idea, not your idea. Then, holding up both mini books between his thumb and index finger, he said, These two different things are just still one idea, right? Greg nodded. Right, and the idea was mine first. Mr. Z leaned forward. But the thing about a true idea is that no one can really own it, even the person who uses it first. In mathematics, the Sumerians were the first to use the idea of place value over 5,000 years ago, but they did not own that idea. And when you sit here in my room adding large numbers and you carry the tens or the hundreds over the next place column, does a Sumerian come running up to the room and say, Hey, quit it! That was my idea! Greg didn't answer. He lowered his eyes and stared at the smear of green gum on the floor. Mr. Z went on. Now, if Mara had used her character, this Creon guy, or if she had made her own her drawings look just like yours, then I think you'd have more of a reason to be upset. But she didn't do that. She used an old idea, a small book in her own way. And yes, she might have seen you do it first, But that's the way ideas work. They spread. So I don't think you should be mad at Mara. If anything, you should feel flattered. Someone thought the way you used an old idea was so new and interesting that she wanted to try it out for herself. Mr. Z paused. Greg was looking down at his feet, studying his sneakers. He decided to just let Mr. Frizzyhead talk himself out. Why argue? The sooner this guy finished yakking, the sooner he could leave for soccer practice. Look at me, Greg. Greg tipped his head back. He flicked his eyes to the teacher's face and then back to the floor. The math teacher said, Is any of this making sense to you? Greg shrugged. Sure, I guess so. Then I think this all adds up to one thing. Mr. Z paused, waiting for Greg to look him in the face. It didn't happen, so he said, Greg, you need to apologize to Mara. Greg's head jerked up. Apologize? Me? No way! Mara knew how stubborn Greg was, and she'd liked the talk they'd been having before the teacher had arrived. She quickly said, It's okay, Mr. Z. He doesn't have to apologize. Mr. Z said, Yes, he does. First, he has to apologize to you, and then he has to apologize for me for making a huge disturbance in my room and wasting precious class time, and all because of a comic book. Greg felt the fury rising in his chest. He wanted to tip his head back and howl like Creon. He wanted to get up close to this man's huge nose and shout, I'm the guy with the black eye here. I'm the one who had the idea ripped off. Apologize. This is so stupid. No, actually, you're stupid. Greg felt his face getting red, felt his heart pounding. So again, are we noticing Greg's emotions right now? And then for the second time in one day, Greg felt his nose begin to bleed. Only this time it was a real gusher. Blood streamed out his left nostril over his lips and dripped off his chin, splattering his shirt and the desk. Mr. Z put one hand over his mouth, and with the other, he pointed a shaky finger, his eyes wide. Oh, your nose, it's, but he couldn't say the B word. Mr. Z's face went pale as paper. Sweat stood out on his forehead, and behind his hand, and still covering his mouth, his breath came in gasps. Earlier, Greg hadn't noticed Mr. Z's reaction to blood. This time, he couldn't miss it, and he decided to enjoy it. Greg leaned forward and nodded at Mr. Z, making an effort to stop the flow. Yes, my nose is bloody, very bloody. It's bleeding and blood. It's getting all over the place. Bloody, bloody blood. Mr. Z turned away, almost throwing up. Greg, Mara snapped. Stop it. That's mean. She'd already grabbed the tissues from the teacher's desk. Here. And she pushed the box into Greg's hand. Turning to Mr. Z, she said, Can I get you something? Some water? Mr. Z shook his head. I just need to lie down. And with Mara to steady him, he eased out of the desk onto the floor, flat on his back, eyes closed. Now you, Mara said to Greg, sit on the floor and lean forward and squeeze your nose hard. Greg followed orders, but then decided he'd be more comfortable lying down. Mara said, I'll get the nurse and a cold pack, 2 cold packs. And she left Greg and Mr. Z littering the floor of room 27. So today we're really going to think about these characters in our stories, and we're going to think about Mr. Z. So let's think, how can we describe Mr. Z? So here we have a small paragraph. It says he had been planning what he would say to Greg and Mara all afternoon. He already knew exactly what he wanted this meeting to end up, but he was prepared to take his time getting there. In his mind, it was like a math problem. He would add the right ideas and subtract and so on. And so could we say that maybe, again, he really likes math. He always compares things to math. And we know that he's a math teacher. So that's one way we can describe Mr. Z, is that he really likes math. Maybe he's really logical. He likes to think things through. And then it says, quiet, both of you. Mr. Z was not used to raising his voice. So that's important as well. He's not used to raising his voice. So we can say maybe he's usually a very calm person, maybe very level-headed. Imagine some of those teachers that that never really raise their voice. They always are just speak very calmly. So when they yell, you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening here? And then let's see what else we can say. And then remember, Greg's nose starts bleeding. And what happened to Mr. Z? Put his hand over his mouth and has a shaky finger, right? He's starting to shake. His breath comes in gasps. What's happening to Mr. Z, right? He doesn't like blood. He's super afraid of blood. And so he ends up having to lay on the floor. And so we can say Mr. Z, he really loves math. He's very calm, but he hates blood. So these are some details that our author is giving us to help us get a better picture or understanding of Mr. Z. So let's go back to our learning intentions for today. We are learning to describe characters and settings so we can examine how the literary elements of a narrative work together. So we know we're successful when we can describe the characters in the story based on their thoughts, emotions, and actions. So while we were reading, we thought about Greg and his emotions. And then at the end, we focused on Mr. Z and his actions and his thoughts as well to be able to describe them. And then, like I said, we focused on the setting last time, so we didn't focus so much on the setting today. But characters in the story based on their thoughts and actions, check. And then yesterday, we had done that setting. So we'll check that off again. All right, and to your reading response. Why is it important for readers to understand how characters feel when they speak? Why do you think that's important, and why have we been talking about that in these last couple of lessons? I want you to think about that and give me a couple of sentences to explain why you think that is important. All right, that is all for today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Be kind to one another, do all of your work, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!